We now continue with Cruise Planning and Cruising Course, Chapter 9, The Formalities of Cruising in Foreign Waters. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is a unified border agency within the Department of Homeland Security, responsible for the management, control, and protection of our nation's borders. Upon arrival in any port or place within the U.S., including the U.S. Virgin Islands, from a foreign port or place, the master of the vessel shall immediately report that arrival to the nearest Customs and Border Protection facility or other location designated by the port director. The master must also report any foreign merchandise on his boat that is subject to duty. The decal is required for all private boats 30 feet or more in length that will be entering the U.S. Current cost, this is 2013 cost, is $27.50 per calendar year. American pleasure boats must be documented by the U.S. Coast Guard or must display the identification number issued by a state, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, or the District of Columbia. The Nexus Marine Program is a joint U.S.-Canada initiative that offers facilitated customs and immigration clearance for recreational low-risk boaters entering both the U.S. and Canada through the registration into the program. Under the Canadian Border Boat Landing Permit I-68 program, after initial inspection, boaters entering the U.S. may report their arrival by small pleasure boat in the United States by telephone without having to appear as a port of entry or other CBP designated facility for an in-person inspection. The local boater option available in Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands is a voluntary program that allows eligible, low-risk, frequent pleasure boat operators and passengers to register themselves and their vessels with CBP. The registration process includes a background check and an interview. The small vessel reporting system is a voluntary online reporting tool to expedite the entry process into the United States for participating boaters. As of May 2011, the SVRS was available along the U.S. northern border and in Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, with other areas to become available nationwide. The OARS program is a program for satisfying both the report of arrival and the face-to-face inspection requirements for entry into the U.S. The OARS program uses video phones typically located at public marinas. No enrollment in the program is necessary. OARS substitute an electronic inspection for a physical face-to-face one. The system consists of an auto-dial telephone, a video transceiver, a monitor, a facial camera, and a document camera. To operate the system, the traveler either picks up the handset or pushes the call button. This system allows the officer to view travel documents and both the traveler and the officer to view one another as the inspection is taking place. Typically, OARS reporting satisfies the in-person inspection requirement, but as with other programs, a Customs and Border Patrol officer still may direct a boater to report to a port of entry or designated location for an in-person inspection. Here is the user Fee Decal. The I-68 are used to clear U.S. Customs and Immigrations by phone from Canada. Nexus are used to clear into Canada and U.S. by phone. New Nexus cards have holograms and look more professional or nicer. New cards are being sent out to existing Nexus holders. I-68 and Nexus can be used on Pacific, Atlantic, and Great Lakes. Nexus application procedures require 3 background checks by Canada, then the U.S., and an interview by Canadian Customs and U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. Each person aboard must have an I-68 or Nexus to use a phone call for clearance. The I-68 must be renewed each year. The individual fee is $16. The Nexus is good for 5 years. Nexus can be on boats, cars, and aircraft. Nexus will not be approved by Canada if you have a felony charge or conviction. A DUI is a felony in Canada. To go over informal entry procedures, there are two basic kinds of customs processes. Informal entry is a simple process that tourists are familiar with when they enter the country by plane or cruise ship and fill out the custom declaration form. Custom inspection by the Customs Border Patrol may be held at an inspection facility aboard the vessel or waived. This is the type of entry we will be using going into the BVIs as well as coming out of the BVIs. A formal entry is a more complicated process involving the posting of a bond. An American pleasure boat arriving in the U.S. from a foreign port or place is not required to make a formal entry provided the vessel is not engaged in trade. The vessel has not visited any hovering vessel. The master reports arrival as required by law and is in compliance with the U.S. Customs and Navigation laws. And any article on board required by law to be entered or declared is reported to the customs agent immediately upon arrival. In addition to controlled substances, for example narcotics, there are prohibitions and restrictions on the importation of fruits, plants, meats, or other plant and animal products, birds, or other live organisms of any kind. Dogs and cats taken out of the United States and returned are subject to the same requirements as those entering for the first time. Customs and Border Patrol advises travelers to register their firearms prior to leaving the country to expedite clearance upon their return to the United States. Take the firearm to the nearest Customs and Border Patrol office and request a certificate of registration for personal effects taken abroad. It is necessary to make an emergency stop. If it is necessary to make an emergency stop in the U.S. to preserve life or property, the master must report as soon as possible to the nearest Customs, Immigration, Agriculture, or Public Health officer. If your boat has anchored or tied up, you are considered to have entered the U.S. Stay where you are. No one shall board or leave the boat without first completing Customs and Border Patrol's processing unless the Customs and Border Patrol in charge grants permission to do so. The only exception to this requirement is to report arrival. There are no clearance procedures when pleasure craft leave the U.S. Most other countries require proof of the last foreign port clearance for entry into their countries. All recreational boaters are required to present themselves upon their arrival in Canada. Arrival in Canada occurs when the pleasure craft crosses the international boundary into Canadian waters. The only exception to this presentation requirement applies to vessels that are in transit through Canada. In order to be considered in transit, the vessel must be proceeding directly from one point outside of Canada to another point outside of Canada. In transit movement must be continuous, uninterrupted, and without delays or stopovers. There is a no landing cellular reporting. U.S. citizens who are operating private boats do not plan on landing on Canadian soil and are not in transit may present themselves by cellular phone to the Canadian Telephone Reporting Center. Owners, operators of private boats that are strictly weaving in and out of Canadian waters but are not in transit will be required to call the TRC only once at the time of their initial entry into Canadian waters. Designated telephone marine reporting site requirements. The master of a recreational boat planning on landing must take the vessel directly to one of the CBSA designated telephone reporting marine sites and call the TRC. To find the designated telephone reporting marine sites in your area, call the same number, 1-888-226-7277. So there are some special border programs with Canada. Nexus, as we mentioned earlier, that's the joint Canada-US. Nexus Marine Program has already been described under the U.S. Special Border Programs. The reporting procedures, however, are somewhat different when entering from Canada. Boat owners, operators are responsible for reporting themselves and all those on board to a Nexus telephone reporting center at least 30 minutes before, but no more than 4 hours prior to the boat's estimated time of arrival at a designated marine reporting site in Canada. TRCs allow individuals who enter Canada by private boat not only to report their arrival, but also to make their declarations of goods to the CBSA by telephone. If you have goods that exceed your personal entitlement, you will be advised by the necessary procedures to follow by the border officer at the Nexus telephone reporting center. The boat owner operator must remain at the designated marine reporting site until the latter of A, the ETA reported to the TRC, or B, the actual time of arrival. If no CBSA officer appears, the boat may proceed to the final destination and passengers may disembark. No second call to the TRC is required. The CAN Pass. CAN Pass is a private boats program that provides expedited border clearance for low-risk, pre-screened persons entering Canada by private pleasure craft. U.S. citizens and permanent residents without criminal records may apply for this program. To use the program, all persons on board must be program members. Narcotics, foods, plants, and animals. Travelers cannot import controlled, restricted, or prohibited animals, plants, or goods. It's not surprising there are restrictions on importing alcoholic beverages and tobacco products. Publications describing import restrictions are available at www.cbsa.gc.ca. Pets. Bring vaccination certificates for pets. Dogs and cats from the U.S. that are at least 3 months old need signed and dated certificates from a veterinarian verifying that they have been vaccinated against rabies within the last 3 years. The certificate must clearly identify the animal. If your dogs or cats are less than 3 months old, you do not need a certificate of rabies vaccination. However, the animals must be in good health when they arrive. Firearms. If you are a visitor to Canada and do not have a Canadian firearms license and registration certificate, you are required to declare your firearms in writing. The laws related to importations of firearms and weapons are complex and strict with 3 categories of weapons. Prohibited: mace, pepper spray, stun guns, small handguns, automatics. Restricted: semi-automatics, and non-restricted: regular hunting rifles and shotguns. But even non-restricted weapons on a vessel prevent challenges to clear. A Canadian entry with firearms should not be made without first consulting a Canadian embassy or consulate for specific advice. Mexico. So entry requirements here. The vessel must proceed directly to the nearest port of entry with both queue and courtesy flags flying. You will make 3 stops at the port: immigration, customs, and the port authority. In addition, a 4th, medical quarantine clearance might be required. Depending on the port, 1 or more of the stops could be combined. The port authority will assess a fee based on tonnage. Documents that you will need to submit: crew lists. Multiple copies of the crew list must be submitted to each of the immigration, customs, and the API. Port Authority. The forms must be in Spanish. Travel documents. For everyone on board, a valid passport and a photo ID. Tourist entry form, FMT. The FMT must be filled out for everyone on board. Vessel documentation. Proof of ownership of the boat will be necessary to get a temporary import permit. Originals are necessary. U.S. ZARPI. A U.S. outbound clearance document called a ZARPI is required for entry by vessel into Mexico. Before leaving the U.S., the captain should obtain Customs and Border Protection Form 1300 from the CBT, Customs and Border Protection. As of 2012, all boats entering Mexico who fail to present a ZARPI are subject to a $5,000 fine. Proof of insurance, the marinas may require this. Documents that you need to obtain. Tourist cards. For U.S. citizens, visas are not required, but tourist cards will be necessary. You can get those on arrival from the immigration office. Temporary import permit for boat. At customs, the captain should present the vessel's papers proving ownership and obtain a temporary import permit. List all the Mexican ports of call on the permit. Health permit may be required, depending upon many other things, the vessel's port of departure. Mexican ZARPI. This departure clearance document may be necessary for entry into the next foreign port or requested by the Mexican Navy. And fishing permits. Whether you plan on fishing or not, if there is any fishing gear on board, a fishing permit is necessary and should be obtained before you leave. The Bahamas. So the entry requirements here. Proceed to the port of entry with hoisted Q flag. Both customs and immigrations will board your vessel when in port. If you go to a marina, the marina will make the arrangements with customs and immigration. Pratique will only be granted after the boarding. Entry fees are required based on vessel and number of those on board. Travel documents, passports are required, but visas are not for U.S. citizens. Bahamian forms, a maritime declaration of health, crew lists, and inward report for pleasure vessels and customs clearance forms will have to be completed. Everyone on board must fill out an immigration card. The customs form and immigration form can be ordered from the Bahamas Tourist Office in Florida. Solvency, etc. Establishing the wherewithal to leave, an airplane ticket, cruising permit, as well as sufficient monies to cover a stay is necessary. Temporary cruising permit. A cruising permit will be issued for 12 months, but multiple entries are covered for only a 90-day permit, period. The permit covers all the Bahamian Islands. It must be shown to port officials and members of the Royal Bahamas Defense Force and be kept on board at all times. Ship movement. In the larger ports of Nassau, Freeport, and Georgetown, vessel movements are controlled, and so you must contact the local harbor control on VHF 16 when entering and departing. Clearing out. Immigration cards and the cruising permit should be surrendered upon leaving the Bahamas. The permit can also be mailed from the next destination. You should obtain a departure clearance document if there is any chance it will be needed at the next foreign port. Firearms on board must be declared to customs. Weapons must be kept in secure locker. Firearms may not be taken ashore without a police permit. The British Virgin Islands. So, arriving by boat, proceed directly to the port of entry. The Q flag must be flown when vessels arrive outside of business hours. Registration with immigration will take place the next day. Vessels must tie to jetties or anchor in the harbor. A marina may only be entered if an agent has been employed. No one can leave the vessel until pratique has been granted. All members of the crew must be present to clear immigration. Note that the full customs clearance out and in is necessary by both the U.S. and British Virgin Islands when cruising between them. Travel documents. Passports are required, but visas are not for U.S. citizens. Vessel papers, passports, inward-outward manifest, crew list, and last clearance must be presented. Cruising fee. Private boats are granted a 30-day cruising permit for a modest fee. Chartered boats are treated differently. Easy Clear. Easy Clear is a Caribbean pre-arrival notification and form filing request system. Registered users maintain up-to-date information online about their vessel and those on board. The service facilitates but does not replace clearing customs. The same online service can be used for some other Caribbean countries. Go to www.eseaclear.com. All firearms must be declared and surrendered to customs until leaving BVI. In short, no firearms may be kept on board even if in a sealable secure locker. Dogs and cats are only permitted entry with an import permit. The BVI is classified a rabies-free territory, so strict regulation applies to pets from the United States and other countries known to have rabies outbreaks. An application for a permit must be made to the Department of Agriculture Veterinary Division prior to pet arriving in the BVIs. So the boat book. So this would be a manual where you'd keep all of your important papers for the boat in one place. You would take this book with you to the Customs Immigration Office along with all your travel documents. Some people fix these books up so they have little pockets to put all the passports in, so as they go out to meet with the customs officials, possibly in the dinghy, they don't have to worry about things falling out and getting lost. It would have items in there like crew list, captain certifications, boater education documents, radio station and individual operator license, permits, insurance documents, medical information, emergency protocols, boat data, inventory information, and possibly even bank statements. You may want to include customs information, receipts for purchases, etc. A boat book creates order out of the chaos by keeping all information and documents you need for clearing entry. Under Federal Communication Commission requirements, pleasure boaters need ship station license and operator permits for MF, HF, and SSB marine radios, but do not need such license and permits for VHF radios unless the vessel is a power boat 20 meters or longer. In the front of your boat book, have a collection of items needed for clearance into a new country or returning. Have not only customs forms, but booklets on how to enter and what is allowed should ease your clearance. A plastic baggie for purchase receipts will organize record keeping and make tax reports easier. And that is the end. Thank you all for listening.